Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I'm delighted that we have as our next participant in the Personal Histories and Conflict Resolution series, Jackie Font-Guzmán, who is absolutely a legend in the conflict resolution field. I think many of you know she is the Executive Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and a full professor at Eastern Mennonite University. She was a Fulbright Scholar and the recipient of the 2017 Nova Southeastern University Distinguished Alumni Achievement Award. But she's also a mediator and arbitrator. She's certified by the Puerto Rican Supreme Court. She was at Creighton University for many years. So it's a wonderful thing that we have her with us today. And so I want to start out by saying, Jackie, thank you so much for making the time to be with us.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I also want to say how much I enjoyed your chapter. We had a chat the other day, and I was mentioning to Jackie, I'm kind of obsessed with this book. I love this book. I keep rereading these chapters, but your chapter in particular I love because it stands out from so many of the other chapters in the book. And I think conflict resolution has been a big part of your career, but you've worn so many other hats over the course of your career. You've been an advocate, you've been a lawyer, you've been a higher ed administrator, and now you have this position at EMU. So I just, maybe we could start out first, and I want to go through the different stages sort of your career that you navigate in the chapter. But I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about sort of how your conflict resolution work has influenced the other hats that you've worn as a higher ed administrator and now your role at EMU, but also how those other hats as an advocate and a lawyer have influenced the way that you look at conflict resolution.
Yeah, so I see myself, there was a significant period of time, and I think it continues, that I would reinvent myself every 5 years or so. And by reinvent, I mean go to school, get a whole new profession, and then practice the profession. And so if I were going to fragment my life in before conflict came into my world, conflict engagement and resolution, and after, I would say the before part, which was when I was a healthcare administrator and then a lawyer, was that there was something always missing, in the sense that I kept on trying. What drew me to these two early professions was actually my desire to be of service to people and to serve a particular population, those that are usually marginalized or underrepresented, or in the case of healthcare, going through amazing pain and conflict, right? Even though I didn't have the conflict language yet.
Right.
And a lot of that was, I saw my role as more doing individual contacts, right? So in advocacy and as a lawyer, you're doing this individual right. And in healthcare, you were managing, and I wasn't too aware of the structural aspects of what was driving or forcing those environments where I was. And then about 10 years, well, like 5 years into 6 years into my law career, I actually discovered mediation through a friend who literally took this application to my office. I was litigating at the time, my calendar was insane. And he went and he said, "You must do this because this is the future." And at the time he was framing it like the future of the law, right? Because he was a lawyer as well. And I was like, I'm really busy and I just don't have time for this. And he literally, short of writing the essays that I needed to write, sat down and wrote my name and my address and everything and said, "You're going to do this today, just put a pause and do it." And the application was for a training, transformative mediation training, way back in the days when the Postal Service was starting their transformative mediation way of changing their culture as to who they were at the Postal Service. And so Puerto Rico had that training. And so I ended up going. And so in a way that afterward, what it has done is it has helped me in my mind to take those individual skills I had and the advocacy at the individual level and try to combine it more at the systemic structural level. I'm trying to put those two things together. And that was something that was missing in my life, I think, before my exposure and my getting to know what conflict was all about. And so it informs everything I do as an administrator now, but also as a faculty, the way I teach, the way I interact with colleagues, the way I interact with my students, with the staff in institutions. So it has been I think it's been a significant marker in my life, actually.
Absolutely. And I think, again, one of the reasons why your chapter stands out is because I think there are a lot of people in the book who say, I discovered conflict resolution very early in my career and I decided this is it. This is what I'm going to do for my whole career. And they may have hesitance about thinking about things from an advocacy perspective, or maybe challenging some of those systemic components because they want to maintain their neutrality. That's the role of the mediator. But I love your willingness to take on all of these different roles and sort of have them influence each other. Before we move on, you told the story about the training in Puerto Rico with the Postal Service. And I
Right.
love that story from the book. I was wondering if you could just tell a little bit more about what was the dynamic of the revolt, in that training, and how did it influence your early thinking about dispute resolution?
Yeah. So it was interesting. Like I said, I ended up applying, and was selected. I want to say there were probably about 12 to 15 people, trainees. And so I ended up going, and we went in, and at the time it was Andrew Thomas was the trainer, and some of you may know him. He's been in the field for quite some time.
Right.
And it was the very first time I was exposed to mediation. The very first thing, I didn't know anyone in the field. I had not read one single book. I just stepped in and carved those 3 days. And he was, and I can't remember who it was, but he was with a colleague at the time who I know she was also in transformative mediation. And I remember it was a white woman. And I want to say may have been Sally Pope, but I'm not 100% sure. And most of the people in the room, I would say at least all of them, except probably 2 or 3, were actually lawyers. And so I knew many of them, and they were all from Puerto Rico. And for all of them, Spanish was the native language, even though the training was in English. And they had this very prescribed way, and I'm not using prescribe in a necessarily negative way. They had a set of role plays and a set of organization to the process that had been working well apparently in the US, and so Puerto Rico was a little bit of a different dynamic. It was the first time they actually rolled out that workshop. And I think the fact that most of us were lawyers and the fact that we were all Puerto Ricans really made for a shift in dynamics. We were very skeptical. We were very open to challenging and voicing our skepticism out loud with no problems. And because of the way I think many of us, or most of us, are socially, how we deal with ourselves in Puerto Rico, we tend to be very social. We tend to talk a lot. We tend to, what I think many people, without stereotyping, but many people from other cultures, including many places in the US, would be received as being interrupting. For us, it was more a level of engagement. And so conversations were happening at a table while they were talking. It was just, I think from their perspective, it was just really generating out of chaos, and we started giving a lot of pushback. But what I do remember of that session was how so swiftly and elegantly and authentically Andrew Thomas just paused, named it, addressed it, acknowledged it. This is not working. What do we do to do better? And I remember they took a time out. They went out in a room. They restructured whatever they were doing for the rest of the day. They came back. They asked for feedback, and they promised to do the same for the next 2 days that were to come. And at the time, remember, I was a lawyer. I had no idea what conflict resolution was. I had not read anything. In fact, I didn't even know what mediation was, other than, well, someone puts together 2 people and they try to solve a conflict. That was the level of understanding I had. And it triggered something in me about, maybe there is something about this. If this individual who has no idea who we are is willing to come to a foreign place for him, and be willing to be so vulnerable and be able to see the process so malleable, but at the same time with structure. I remember just thinking in my head, well, I'm still skeptic, but there may be something to this. And so I think he really had such a profound impact in my future without ever really knowing it, by just having that, what would have seemed to be an insignificant act.
Yeah, and it's funny to think about those 2 moments. Your friend that filled out the form for you and said, you're going to do this, you're going to make the time. And then also Andrew, when the training kind of melted down, I think many of us have had that experience.
Yep.
To be able to say, okay, this isn't working. How do we reinvent it? And that sort of was an interesting, with you, you're like, wow, this is intriguing that somebody would do that, would have sort of the ability to
Right.
listen and redesign on the fly. If not for those two things, maybe the whole trajectory of your career would have been completely different. It's amazing to look back on that.
Yes, I've always wondered, right? Like, what would have been different?
Sure. And then obviously that led to you going to Nova Southeastern and getting your
Yes.
PhD in conflict resolution. So talk a little bit about Nova and how that, what you learned there and how it expanded your conceptualization of conflict resolution.
Yeah, so that was one of those points where I reinvented myself. I was actively litigating, but after I took that training, I started doing mediations and with the Postal Service, and then it kept on expanding. And little by little, in the latter 5 years to 6 years that I was practicing, my law practice started shifting a little bit more, doing mediation, facilitation work, and training in the field, and always litigating, but less and less. So I started to see a shift. And what I realized as I was training was that I needed to have a deeper level of understanding, that there was a lot more to this field, that it was actually a field, that this was not only a skill set, right? That this was not only a process that you could learn and get good at and improve, that there was more to it. And once again, I had that feeling of there's something missing. I want to figure out what more is there here that I can do with this. And so that led me to Nova Southeastern University. And part of it was I was in Puerto Rico at the time. That was Florida. I figured out I really wanted to do a PhD because I had so many questions. I wanted to be able to learn more about research. And as most of JDs, they don't really teach us how to do that type of empirical research. And the other aspect of it is I started thinking that I was enjoying training, that I may want to go into teaching at some point in time, and I needed that skill set. And so that, and the fact that they were in Florida and that they had online, a hybrid kind of model where they had online and then you had to go there. I believe it was once or twice a year as you kept on progressing. That led me to Nova, and it was a really, from my perspective, an amazing experience, because I was surrounded by people that were asking questions in a different way. And I was always being drawn to more the qualitative research methodology. And so the impact of stories, of really being able to use that as a tool, as a research tool, as a way to actually get to people's stories and themes and life, and from there make all sorts of learning about what people were experiencing. And so it was a great time. There was a really good combination at the time, and I say at the time because Nova is one of those institutions where they don't have tenure, at least in the master's and PhD program at Nova, at that school. And so that means that the faculty composition tends to change a little bit over time. But at the time I was there was a really, really good balance of practice and theory. And so the other thing that did was it started exposing me to people like Jean-Paul Lederach, Bernie Mayer, Michael Lang. I mean, all these people in the field that were seeing conflict from a different perspective, that they were actually practitioners, but they were also being informed by theory. And so that opened a whole new world for me.
Absolutely. And actually, and that ties into your thesis, which turned into your book, right? Can you just speak a little bit about that?
So my thesis was not a traditional conflict engagement thesis either. For starters, I had two anthropologists on my dissertation, and what I looked at was the stories of people. I used phenomenology, which was basically how people experienced. In my case, I chose how people experience legal terms such as citizenship and cultural national identity, things that are framed as legal many times or social. So my driving question was, how did a specific set of Puerto Ricans experience citizenship and cultural national identity in a country or in a place where they didn't have any say or very little say in the rules and laws that govern their daily living because they're a colony and an unincorporated territory of the USA. And so I was teasing at how do people navigate this? How do people navigate through this conflict? What does this mean? And how do they use their experiences to assert their national identity and live into that and preserving that. So it was interesting because I remember at the time I was between that and a bioethics conflict engagement mediation, because again I had that healthcare background.
Right.
But I ended up going with this other more identity sustainable intractable conflicts like colonialism and those type of things.
Sure. Yeah. And another story you talk about, which is fascinating, is this experience you had with the student group in Latin America, the mediation that you were invited. And I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit about that experience. Was that after you finished the PhD?
Actually, that was during my PhD.
During the PhD, which that's fascinating.
Yes.
You're writing that thesis that you described and talking about that experiential, and then you go and have this experience working with these students as well, but also the dissonance between you and the other facilitator. I was wondering if you could just tell that story a little bit, because I think it's so
it was really it was this, and I was like probably midpoint through my I was probably 2/3 into my PhD actually at conflict, so I was still full-time working also and as a lawyer and as a facilitator mediator, and I get an invitation from Department of State to go in, and originally the training, it was to train judges across the 3 different states in the country, which is Venezuela. It was Venezuela at the time. President Chavez had just won. He had been there for probably 2 or 3 years, maybe. And there has been already some significant shifts and changes that were happening. And so my visit, the origin of my visit was to go in and for a 2-3 week period, it was a 3-week period, do training for judges that were trying to include some sort of restorative justice or mediation or conflict engagement within the court system. So it was more like that ADR, alternative dispute resolution connected court annex kind of thing, but it was training the judges. And so we went through 3 different states. And while I was there, because Venezuela was starting to get really unstable, there was a particular group of students in one of the universities where they were threatening, they had started to burn tires and cars and taken over the university.
Wow.
In that particular state. And as many of you may know, that have done work outside, even in Puerto Rico and in Latin American countries, the protest of students protesting in universities escalates pretty quickly. It's not as we do a lot more than just putting out signs and not going to classes, and so it really can get very quickly out of hand. And so the concern of the Department of State was that of all the universities in Venezuela, that particular university was one that once they started, if that escalated, the pattern and the trend was that all the other universities and within the university system of the public system would join. And so originally I was called in to do a mediation, and I wasn't quite sure why they were calling it mediation, but I said, let's just roll with it and see what we can do. And the contact person from the embassy had what I think was just a very superficial training, right? Like the basic, let's go in, get a training, let's learn about interests. And that was about it. And so she asked me to pass by her office and gave me actually an hour clock, because she wanted me to set a very rigid structured process of when each one of these representatives from each group of affiliation group from the university, the students they represented, how everything was going to go and happen. And she kept on saying, this is a very volatile group. You need to be careful. It could be dangerous. And I would remember thinking in my head, it's like, I've been there and done this. I ended up in the United States studying because I participated actively in a university, the University of Puerto Rico strike of 1980, and it was just a hot mess.
Sure.
And so in my mind, it's like, that's what being a student is about. And so needless to say, the liaison that was from Venezuela looked at me like really nervous. And I just told her, we're not doing this, so don't worry. I'm not using this hour clock. This is not what we're doing. and I could see she was relaxed. And so we ended up doing this mediation in the middle of the mountains in the Andes, because they wanted some neutral place. And we took a very relational approach. It was, they didn't really need mediation, because this wasn't something that we could work out through mediation. There were like 6 or 7, like 7 or 8 actually student representatives from each one of these groups. And we just ended up really eating lasagna, having some beers. And what we ended up doing was having a facilitated dialogue process. And there was really nothing to solve at the time. But we had a really good conversation about their needs and really the structural violence that was driving all of this. So I remember thinking at the time, we're not going to solve anything, but if I can contain it enough so that then it gives them time to think through and what the next steps would be, that would be a good thing. And so that's what we did. But it was a fascinating experience.
Well, I can't help but dial back to the way you described the way Andrew, in the training that sort of melted down with the revolt of the participants, was so able to reshuffle and say, hey, well, let's rethink this. And then also you in the situation in the Andes, where the person that brought you in gave you the clock and said, well, here's how we're going to run this. You're like, no, we're not going to do it. And then, but then also dialing to the role you play now at EMU, there's sort of a through line there, which I think is interesting. And I want to pull that out. But another thing that's very interesting, and I think the story serves as a great way to illustrate this, is your co-facilitator, I think, had a different frame for the behavior of the students. And yes. I think, and so there was cultural tension between the two of you and the way that you conceptualize the action of the students. And I think that sort of gets to some of the underlying assumptions maybe that exist within the field that sometimes we don't talk to. So I was just wondering if you could give it, and I want to go back and revisit that in greater depth in our future conversation, but in light of this story, could you tell that? Yeah.
So I mean, I realized it was really a worldview kind of shock, right? I came from a place where protesting in those ways would be considered extremely violent and not civil here, but we did take over classrooms and we did shut it down, and we would go in and remove people from classrooms, and the National Guard would come in and start shooting. Like that was my experience when I was going, and you're running, and you better run quickly, because there is a history of students have been killed in this protest by National Guard. And so from my frame of mind, this was really, it was part about being students, right? Like this is what you do. But second, the whole structure that she wanted to impose of one person talks at a time, and let's do an hour clock, and let's just control emotions. I knew that if Venezuelans were anything like Puerto Ricans, that wasn't going to work. And it turned out they were similar to Puerto Ricans. And that emotion and that anger is what gets us to places. And that we're not really interrupting each other. We're really engaging with each other when we are engaging in behavior that looks like interrupting in other places. That we had zero, probably, or very close to zero, trust in institutional government. And some of you may know there's actually a scale that measures this, and Puerto Rico is always so low that is, and I haven't looked at it in the last like 10 years, so I can't even imagine what it is now. So, I couldn't come in to suggest what were rules that I knew were going to be constraining, and that almost seemed too similar to what they were fighting against to begin with. That I needed to go more with the flow, figure out what they needed, and just figure out and look for the patterns of interaction that were happening.
Sure.
As opposed to trying to come in with the preconceived idea that if they're from Venezuela, or if they're like me, or if they're from Puerto Rico or whatever, that I needed to act in a certain way. And so in my mind, of course, I'm doing the comparisons, but it was more about where do these people sit or lie in all of this, their level of trust to authority, their level of how can I tease this out by the way they're interacting and the questions they are giving us. And for me, mediation has always been the traditional mediation, as in the books, because I really know, having a lot of colleagues that are mediators, that that's not how they roll, right? But certainly what they taught us way at the beginning on some of the premises embedded in these processes and models are that we need to be orderly and sequential and you know, what is it in getting to yes, you use emotions like go out on the balcony and vent and then come back. And that doesn't resonate with everyone, and it never really did resonate with me. And even the whole thing of neutrality and not being an advocate.
Yeah.
So I guess because I came in so long later on into this field, and I had always been advocating, to be honest, I don't feel I never ended doing that, even when I was doing mediations or facilitations.
Well, and that's, I want to get back to that too, is sort of the dual role of advocate and mediator is a tension that people sometimes feel. But I would say you probably had a lot of credibility with these students because you had taken over buildings in school. You had had the National Guard come in and shoot. You had to run. I mean, they were like, wow, okay, this is somebody that gets it. And I think you describe it also in your chapter as sort of, you know, she just was operating from a different worldview that was very different than yours. And I think that's a fascinating. The other thing that I love you talked about was the I statements that participants in Puerto Rico. Could you just say a moment about that? Because that's also something that's very interesting.
It's another one that is very culturally sensitive. So I'm sure most of you on this call know how we're always taught in many trainings to use I statements when we want to shift someone or there's a behavior that is bothering us, right? So, you know, the basic, when you do X, this is the impact it has on me, right? And except culturally, if you come from a context and a culture that is too direct, that doesn't work, and that feels like an attack. The second you say when you're doing X, you know, or if you do the X, you're putting me too much on the protagonism there, center stage. And I was doing this training and we were practicing this, and there was this one person, actually she was a judge, and she just had the hardest, she just couldn't do it, you know? And it was interesting because it's a very basic thing, right? It's a formula. It's like, this bothers me when you, it couldn't get any simpler than that, right? And she just couldn't do it. And as we started talking, we figured out, well, of course you cannot do it because that's not even how I would do it. I started to think we are more story-based. So what we do is, which can be long and complicated and exasperating if you don't think that way, is that what if I want you to shift a behavior because, I don't know, Colin, you're doing something that is annoying me, instead of saying, Colin, when you do this bothers me, I may actually say, you know, I had a friend or a neighbor once that kept on engaging in this behavior and it was really irritating. And so I dance around it, right? And we're kind of like throwing all these metaphors and examples until finally Colin will say, oh, maybe that's what I'm doing and maybe I should shift. And so it is less direct and it takes a lot of time, but it's the way that we kind of operate. And of course, not everyone is the same way. Sure. So that's why I'm saying, thinking of patterns of interaction, what are the patterns that we're seeing in people usually gets us there better. But there's so many embedded assumptions in our field that quite honestly are very white, male, Ivy League centered. I would dare to say.
Well, and that's where I want to take the conversation too. You know, I do want to talk about your Creighton chapter, but actually I was wondering if you could read a quote from your chapter. Do you have the book in front of you?
I do.
Yeah, if you could go to page 286. You have a section header at the top of the page says the importance of diverse emerging stories. Could you read that first paragraph?
Sure.
For me? Yeah.
When I joined the conflict resolution profession in the United States, however, I noticed that as an African American, Andrew Thomas, who had led my first training, was one of the few non-white professionals in the field. This saddened and still saddens me. The conflict field strives for openness, diverse ways of thinking, and social justice. Yet, when I attend conferences and trainings, I see limited diversity among the scholars and practitioners in the conflict field. I fear that this lack of diversity and inclusion could lead our discipline toward a monolithic professional environment in which the discussion of different perspectives is stagnated. And I am hopeful that conflict practitioners and scholars will proactively seek more diversity. Slowly but surely, I think we're moving in the right direction.
I think that, first of all, this just strikes such a chord with me. And I'm sure many of the people on the call, they feel the same thing. We've been having these conversations in the field for decades, and yet it doesn't really seem to be changing. And it's fascinating to me because at the time you wrote this chapter, correct me if I'm wrong, you didn't know you were going to be taking this role at ENU.
I did not.
Yeah, so now you're living this in a sense, and I think it connects to so many of the stories you tell about systemic power dynamics, and goes back to Montessori school. I think you even say some of the lessons that you learned when your mom took you out. First, not taking a side or not intervening can reinforce power imbalances. So you have to be aware of who benefits and who gets hurt by your decision to stand aside. And second, systems of dominations matter. And I think it's amazing to go back to that experience of your mom taking you out of Montessori school and to think about what the field is wrestling with and now the role that you're in now. And I was just wondering, can you process some of that for me, the sentiment that you expressed in that paragraph and kind of the work you're doing now? And you said slowly but surely, I think we're moving in the right direction, which is great, because I do want to feel that our field is moving in the right direction, but there's a lot more work left to do. So maybe, and maybe you could tie that in also to some of your experiences at Creighton.
Yeah, it's hard to, I think I and all of us, I know many of you are do this work, so it wouldn't be surprising, but I think you need to have, you can't lose hope, right? I mean, like if it becomes so overwhelming that you lose hope, then you can't be in this work. You can't do this line of work of wanting to change structures and systems and work with people, because many times it does really feel like you take 10 steps ahead and then 9 back. And so it's this fluctuation, right? It's always this coming back and forth. And these systems have been in place in the case of the United States, really since, 76, we the people, we the people was never we the people. We the people was the white males, affluent, who knew how to read, we the people kind of thing. And so that's how entrenched they are. And for me and the experiences, and that incident with my mom was like, sometimes you can fight the system and sometimes you can't. And if the structures are not there because you don't have enough of a synergy. So I think when I walk into a structure, you look for those that are, I usually look for those who are, where is the energy? Where is the synergy of energy of change? And based on the work and consulting I've done for many years, if the place is really to the level of toxicity that the amount of people that have that energy to do something is too overwhelming, then one of the big things I learned from the Jesuits at Creighton is that you need to meet people where they're at. And so then you need to figure out, where is this organization or this group or this community in terms of where they want to go with change? And if they're not there, then what is the sphere of influence that I can do? What is within my own personal sphere of influence? And so in my case, depending on where I'm working, those sphere of influences have been different, right? So in the case of Creighton, it was the NCR and the Warner Institute of Negotiation for Conflict program. What was my sphere of influence? Where as director, I could influence and the conversation about curriculum, right? So my colleagues and I would get together, and that was something we had shared power over. So making sure that all voices were heard, making sure that, what are we assigning? And so a lot of it is being able to have, and I remember the former president of Creighton University, Tim Lannon, Father Tim Lannon was what I think a superb leader. And as I was coming here, shifting jobs, and he left Creighton like over 5 years ago, but I kept in touch with him. He gave me one piece of advice, which was, he gave me many, but one that really resonated was, be sure to gauge how much change and how quickly and at what pace people want change. Mm-hmm. And which is true, because we all talk about change, and let's take the field, our profession as an example. Mm-hmm. We've been talking about change for, I'm relatively new compared with some of you, right? But at least the last 16, 17 years I've been here in the US, fully embedded in the field in the United States. At least that long we've been talking about it, right? Mm-hmm. So it's hard. And so I think the question is, what do we need to change? Where are we with the change? How quick we want? And I think these are ongoing conversations that just never end. And when I say that I think we're shifting is because I see more and more people now, not only talking about diversity, but actually talking about equity, not only talking about numbers, but actually talking about quality of relationships. Not only talking about the models, but talking about what can we change about this model, or what are the assumptions embedded within these models that may not resonate. And I also see many more white males in position of privilege and power starting to learn how to use their power to support and stand in solidarity with, as opposed to helping someone else, which also has a very power over kind of dynamic unintentionally. And so when I say that I see that there's hope, is because I see these conversations happening, and because I've had colleagues, white males with a lot of power, intervening in meetings and doing it in a very gracious way, and learning how to do that. And so that also is part of what tells me we are moving in ways that little by little will get somewhere where we want to be.
Well, this is such a rich conversation. I've got about 500 things I want to say, but I want to open it up to our participants, because I think we have a lot more accumulated expertise on the call than just the thoughts rattling around my head. So please, if there's something that you'd like to say, please don't hesitate to put up your hand or just speak out. You know, one of the things that we talked about on our prior call, Jackie, is you know, if you read the critics of dispute resolution, people like Lauren Nader and you know, what they say is conflict resolution mediators often act as allies of the status quo. And, you know, what I've heard in the younger generation in particular, Gen Z, you know, out in the streets, Black Lives Matter, you know, time's up. It's like, you know what? I'm not interested in sitting at the table and negotiating. We've been doing that. We've been having these discussions for decades, and nothing fundamentally is changing. So we are now going to make demands. We're going to go out and push for the things to change that we need, that we want to see, as opposed to just sitting around and talking about it. Because what oftentimes I think a lot of people in conflict resolution at base are conflict avoiders. And again, this may be more of a US. It's interesting to see these models as you describe in Puerto Rico. But, you know, I think US organizations have gone around the world and done these trainings. And then the people that they've trained has completely redesigned it to be culturally appropriate in South Africa or in China or Indonesia or wherever. And I think that's gratifying. That's exactly what should happen. But this conflict avoidance orientation is sort of, wow, everybody's angry here. Let's sit at the table and let's get rid of the anger. And the anger is the motivation to change. The anger is what's pushing for the change. And when you remove the anger, well, then you remove a lot of the motivation to change. And then in a sense, you're an ally of the status quo. And this is actually something that you said in your section on Creighton. Disrupting the status quo was terrifying for most members of the law faculty. And I think that that's right. I think a lot of people, when I see conflict, I'm like, well, let me try and get rid of the anger here. But sometimes that's exactly what the participants in that conversation don't want. They want to, because the anger is what's pushing the change. And I think the role that you're playing now, anger is not a bad thing. Anger is part of the conversation, you know? And I think dealing with that is a fascinating aspect of the role that you have, which isn't explicitly a conflict resolution role. But I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Sure. I think the challenge is, I think anger is important. We just can't stay in that constant anger state, because then you get stagnated and you get in an anger space that becomes unproductive. I think the challenge is how you move that anger, how you shift it towards being indignant about a situation. And my grandmother used to say, when you lose your dignity, then you might as well be dead. So I think it's how do you take this this anger, which I think is what I call, and I think Aristotle was the one who used to say that there's like this productive, ethical almost anger, right? That it leads you somewhere. And then how do we become indignant enough to say, I'm not going to let go of this, but I'm going to hold it. I'm going to hold this tension, and I'm going to keep on moving forward, recognizing that there's a tension. And I think you mentioned Gen Z and Gen X and some of these other younger generations. And I think what they're doing, which I think is fascinating, is that what we're seeing is, whether they have the vocabulary or not, and some of them do have it, but others don't, is that what they're looking at is not changing the system or the structures, but actually changing the paradigm and the lens through which we are seeing the systems. Absolutely. And if you think about that way, we've been asking all the wrong questions. because we've been asking all the questions about, so you got discriminated or you got insulted, or, you know, so how can we make it better? You know, or how can we solve your problem? Or how can we transfer you to another unit? Or here's this law. And what I'm seeing is, and what I aspire to do always in those situations is, what do you need to feel safe, to continue to go in your journey and actually advocate for whatever it is that you need to advocate for, whether it is gender equality, whether it is someone that wants to come out and thinks that there'll be implications for that. It's not about, if you look at our generation, the immediate is, oh, don't tell that story. Like, it could damage you professionally. You know, you don't want to go there. This person has a lot of power, or you don't want to do this. And what we should really be doing is, yeah, the system is not working. The structure is not working. What do you need to do what you need to do? And me stand in solidarity with you without removing your agency. And that's a whole different conversation that I don't think, as conflict resolutions practitioners and scholars, we have been inclined to go there. And I think with everything that has happened in the world, and the murder of Floyd and so many other murders, is that a lot of those things are coming to, maybe we have been asking the wrong questions, and it's time for us to ask other questions.
Yeah, you know, I mean, it's interesting. Lauren Nader talks about that too, that the conflict resolution movement has sort of a naivete about power. One, because like, oh, we can level the playing field. All we have to do is just, you know, change the order in which people speak. Like, that's not true. No. But the other thing is, we personalize disputes. It's like, oh, we have a dispute between a professor and a student, and there's a racial element to that. Well, let's have a confidential conversation between the two of them. And if they reach an agreement, well, then we've done our job. But no, it could be that there's systemic issues that are creating that, and other people around the dispute have also been affected by it, but they're not sitting at the mediation table. So by us resolving that, it's like, okay, well, we've removed the irritants, so now we can move on like everything's okay. But that's not the case. You know, there's another paragraph I'd like for you to read, and I think it gets again to the reason why I find you so uniquely valuable in your perspective is because you have the ability to be a mediator and be an advocate. And what I'm finding in this era is I'm meeting, you know, people who are giants, I mean, heroes of mine in the conflict resolution field, who are having their confidence in the mediator role shaken because they see the need to march. They see the need to fight. They see the need to, and they feel like being a mediator means you have to be neutral. You have to be impartial. You can't really have an opinion. You just have to. So the paragraph at the bottom of page 285, it says, I also strive. It starts, I also strive to never let.
Oh yeah. Okay. So it says, I also strive to never let the conflict between parties distract me from the systemic power dynamics that negatively impact their situations outside the mediation. Like the mother of my potential client, they may be struggling with racism, misogyny, unfair housing regulations, poverty, or limited access to healthcare. Being aware of these dynamics allows me to have more empathy for the parties, consider the context in which their conflict is happening, effectively use the power of acknowledgement, and serve them better as they navigate through their conflict.
Right. So maybe if you could just elaborate a little bit on that. It seems like you have a comfort with understanding the systemic context in which these conflicts arise, and also meeting the needs of the parties that you're working with directly. And I think that that's a tension that a lot of people in the field have not resolved. So maybe you could speak to that.
I don't claim to have it resolved it because I certainly do continue to struggle with it, and I certainly get it wrong many times. So I think that's why I'm framing it. You know, it's an aspiration of mine, and I strive to do that, and hold those two tensions together. But people are, I mean, it's like Dugan's theory of conflict, right? There's this nested conflict. And so this individual conflict that may be a conflict of interest is always nested in larger and bigger things. And I think one of the negative part of some things that I think we have done, and maybe even harm that we have done as conflict practitioners on many occasions, is that by trying to do what lawyers do, which is narrow the issue on the conflict, we end up doing a disservice to the parties because we keep them in that one thing. And if you think about it, that's exactly what lawyers also do, right? It's just like, it is your issue. It is not someone else's issue. Or if it's a class action, maybe it's your issue and 10 others or 20 others, but that's it. And we've done that. Many of us have done that. And I was trained when I later took other types of training also outside transformative. I don't know how many trainings I went to where people say, if they raise an issue and the person is not here, then you tell them no, like the focus of the conversation is your issue. Don't bring people who are not here because they're not part of this conversation. And I initially like always struggle with this, and I realized it's like, well, because they are part of the conversation and they are going to be in the room whether you like it or not. And in many ways I feel there's that tension between, yes, people want their conflict sometimes resolved. They really want to walk out of that table with an agreement. And if that's what they want, we really need to honor that. At the same time, what a missed opportunity if we don't push a little to make people become aware that whatever individual situation they think they're actually addressing is embedded in larger structures of privilege, whether it be white privilege or male privilege, or depending on the context of where you are, it could be any kind of privilege, right? And I've always seen mediation and facilitation and the work we do, and this could be the influence of having started with transformative mediation because it was my very, very, very first training, right? That I really see it as a way of changing the world and of really getting us to social change, but only if we do it in that way. I think if we just stay to this embedded assumptions of the models of one person speaks at a time, you have to be fully neutral, then we are sustaining the status quo. I remember when I was in Puerto Rico, I had a practice of mediation among my many clients. It was Raytheon, and Raytheon had a main office in Florida. I would get constantly, they would fly me, pay for my hotel, plus my honorary services to do mediations that I was very well aware that there were colleagues, American colleagues in Florida, where they didn't have to pay for their hotel or anything, that could do the job just as well as me or even better. But every single mediation that had to do with something that they felt was sensitive or racist or higher up people in the organization, they would want to get me because I was neutral. And their definition was, you don't know anyone here, no one knows you, you don't have, stance, as if we could remove ourselves so easily from that. And then in Puerto Rico, it was the other way around. Every, like 80% of the mediations and service I got, it was like, oh, you're the daughter of such and such. Oh, you are the cousin of such and such. And I would get them because I knew people, because I was part of their community. And I remember seeing that and saying, this is, at the time, it's like, this is insane. I am getting as if, and I was still the same person. The fact that I had relocated myself to Florida to do a mediation for someone didn't mean I didn't bring all my biases to the table, right?
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
But it was that concept of neutrality, of status quo, of not changing anything. And so let's just get rid of the problem and move on.
Yeah, yeah. It's fascinating, fascinating. Again, I've got a bunch of comments I want to make, but we're running out of time. Does anyone have any comments, questions, anything they'd like to surface with Jackie? Yeah, Mitch, please.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Jackie, I've really enjoyed reading your piece in the last few days.
Thank you.
And particularly talking about anger. I note that, I've been mediating for years and had many other professions and sort of evolved from what the world calls facilitative mediation into more transformative mediation, partly for the reason that I felt that transformative mediation dealt with anger and emotions in a far more evolved manner than anything else I'd ever seen. And it's triggering some things for me as I look in my life and the work that I'm doing. And I just wanted to share with you all just a quick quote that I read the other night. I'm reading a book called Consolations by David White. And many of you may know his work in different ways, but it's just a quick second, which is, anger is the deepest form of care for another, for the world, for the self, for the life, for the body, for a family, and for all of our ideals, all vulnerable and all possibly about to be hurt. Anger truly felt at its center is the essential living flame of being fully alive and fully here. It's the quality to be followed to its source, to be prized, to be tended, and an invitation to finding a way to bring that source fully into the world through making the mind clearer and make more generous, the heart more compassionate, and the body larger and strong enough to hold it. I just read that the other night, and it really kind of came together as you were speaking, thinking about it. It was with that quote in mind, the words you're sharing is a gift to sort of look at how to really work with anger in our mediation sessions. and how to, as you say again, to meet people where they are. I'm particularly interested in a lot of international issues. I've spent time in Uganda working in orphanages and other cultures, living in Spain. My new father and my daughter's father-in-law is from Puerto Rico. And when we first met, he was constantly interrupting. Well, I was too, because I'm Jewish. So we were doing this thing, and we found that, you know what, we're kind of similar. And we both were taking up a lot of space in the room, having a lot of fun. And now we're extremely close and learning more about our cultures. But you're bringing up these wonderful issues that I know will help me and so many people in terms of looking at, as we explore boundaries, whether it's, you know, mediation without boundaries, different organizations, et cetera, to be sensitive to those issues. So I thank you very much. It's a great gift. And, you know, I know that I will continue to follow you and learn from your work that you're doing. So thank you.
Well, thanks for those kind words, and thanks for sharing that quote. It is extremely powerful. And I think with anger, another conversation that we don't have time to do here, but I think it's something that as mediators and conflict scholars, practitioners, is that with that anger and everything that has happened, there's a lot of trauma and hurt that has been happening in our nation. And so another questions I've been asking myself is, especially with my new DEI, you know, diversity, equity, inclusion role, is also what is our role as people, but also with the fields that we have chosen, to be able to really create the spaces for that trauma and healing to take place at an individual level, at a community level, within our organizations, and at a national level. And I hope is that as a conflict resolution practitioners and scholars, that we actually step up and take an active role in that processes that are going to happen, because they're just barely starting.
Absolutely. Carl, do you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I was fascinated by your quote of your Jesuit president friend who said, judge and be aware of how much change and how far people are willing to go. Say, if you can flesh that out a bit more about what it means to work out of that framework.
So I think for me personally is what I can share in terms of what that means to me. I've been in different places, and because just who I am and what I do and what I like to do, I do want to always advance for change. And I think as I've gotten older, I've learned that there are many routes to that, getting to that change. And that sometimes sometimes there are times to be more confrontational and more, let's get here and let's go here quickly. And that sometimes you need to really create a level of trust with the people that you want to lead for change. And that inevitably takes some time. That people are really truly at different spaces and different places, that even in this era that everyone claims, and many of them authentically want change, that they all don't want change at the same level. That for someone, change can be, we took 3 steps, and for others, it would be, there will only be change when we've taken 100 steps. And so if I go in and I'm trying to gauge where people are at, which is truly one of the many gifts that being in a Jesuit institution allowed me to learn, was that then you can cater where people are willing within a particular community or organization, use their own sphere of influence to effect change. And so that if I see it as part of a larger system, then I can look for those points within an organization that are the points that could be more influential to changing the system of the structure as a whole. And that basically, for me, what it means is a lot of one-on-one conversations with individuals to see where they're at, a lot of active listening, but also questioning, a lot of many of the things that I know you all do, like trying to be non-judgmental, which is so hard sometimes. But once I can gauge where people are and where their passion is, then it's easier. If you're comfortable with a change of 3 steps, then what are the 3 steps you want to take in whatever unit you are, or with your students, or whatever you're doing? If you want to do the 10 steps, then what are the things that we can do with those 10 steps to get you there? And I think, at least for me personally, I used to think of change as a more change, right? Like we're changing the entire university or the entire mediation field or the entire, and it took me a while, but banging my head against the wall to figure out, well, if I can only start gauging how much change each individual people is within their sphere of influence, then we can work towards that. And that's what it means to me. And I remember I'm new at this job now at Eastern Mennonite University. I've only been here 5 months, so I'm still at the stage where a lot of people want to meet with me, and I have one-on-ones constantly. But after about a year and a half, that tends to slow down. I mean, that was my experience at Creighton as well, and every institution. So what I used to do, I literally do this. I do it to this day, is I would sit down with my calendar, and every week I would intentionally see who is the one person I'm going to reach out today that I never see on a daily basis on this campus. Is it someone from sociology? Literally just look up and say, wow, that I want to learn more about their research, if it's a faculty. Is it something about, someone that's literally like the cafeteria person that is serving me coffee every day? I will go and said what, and I was very intentional to the point that I would put it in a calendar. Like I would go out, set a meeting, and seek this out. And what that allowed me to do is precisely start gauging that, and also start connecting with people that are different than me and expanding my network. Because otherwise, what I realize is I would just stay within my peeps. Hey, this is the people of conflict, and I'm in the conflict program, and this feels really comfortable, and this is cool, and we're speaking the same language, and we all want the same things for the most part. So that's what that means to me, that I have to be intentional of engaging in that practice. And I do. I put it on my calendar every single week. I wanted to have one conversation with someone that I would normally never talk. And so for me, that's how I go about it.
Thank you.
That's great. Well, I'm cognizant of the fact we're running out of time. I did want to just point out to everybody, you end your chapter with some great maybe aspirational goals for the field. You say, obviously, we need to bring more underrepresented groups and more diversity into the field, but you express it another way. We need to start seeing who is not in and who should be in our field. And you also talk about stop using disempowering language. When we talk about helping parties, we should start to use empowering language, such as being of service to parties, which that resonates with me a lot. Becoming less concerned with neutrality and more concerned with solidarity, which is great. I love that word. I don't feel that that's used a lot in the conflict resolution field. Focusing more on equity, and less on equality, and then more actively engaging with socio-political conflicts. I think that a lot of people in the field hunger for that. I really do get that sense, is that we don't want to be on the sidelines during this period. And I think your chapter really speaks to that. But I was wondering if you could wrap us up with sort of the last paragraph of your chapter on the bottom of page 293.
Yes. So it says, everyone has an important story. And if you really listen with understanding, curiosity, and creativity, you can design conflict engagement processes that allow people to navigate and possibly disrupt systems of domination so that they can find solutions that meet their needs and recognize their individual dignity. Perhaps most important, we are all the sum of our own cultures, worldviews, and experiences.
I think it's a perfect place to leave it. So if I could just have everyone on the call join me in a round of applause for Jackie. This was just an incredible conversation and discussion. So thank you, Jackie, for all the great work you've done, all the great work that you're going to do, and thank you for sharing this chapter with us and sharing this hour with us.
Well, thanks to all of you, and thanks for having me, Colin.